I am currently in the organizational psychology doc program after completing a bachelor's in business administration and an MBA with a emphasis on project management. I'll go into a little deeper dive. So welcome everyone. My wife is actually also a professor at the Chicago school in a different track. And so her and I spend a lot of time talking about how to be inclusive and how to take different and new approaches now that we know better. So I'm going to maybe go to the next slide. Okay, so a little bit about me. I grew up in a Catholic household with my mom and dad grew up in Kansas City, then moved to Oklahoma when I was in my teens. And I came out as lesbian. I'm a cisgender lesbian at the age of 13 in Oklahoma. My parents were divorced at the time. And it was I was the only lesbian I knew. And so it was a very interesting teenage adolescent time for me. I grew up thinking that I would never be able to have a career, that I would never be able to have a family, that my options were very limited. And if I ever wanted to be successful, I'd have to move to California or New York because I felt like that was the only place where I'd be welcome. I started college. My first week of college, I met my lovely wife, Dr. Jamie Van Meter, down here in this family photo. And we've been together 16 years, married 11, and I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. And about 6 years ago, I was approached at the organization in the energy industry about starting a LGBTQ plus employee resource group. And I had no idea what that was. And I told them that. And I was like, I mean, I'm down, but I don't know what that means. And they were like, there's this conference in 2 weeks in Orlando. And I said, I don't care what it's about. Sign me up. If you're paying for me to go, I'm going to go. And it was out and equal in the workplace. And it is 6,500 individuals who are change makers within their organization that make LGBTQ employees feel welcome, heard, and appreciated, and that they belong. So I went and I was there probably 4 hours before I finally figured out who I wanted to be when I grew up and what I wanted to do. And so since then it was a passion work. So I came back and I did the TMRG for a few years, or the ERG. In my new organization, we say team members instead of employees. So we call them TMRGs. And then I moved into a diversity and equity manager position for the organization and do this work full time. 2 years ago, when George Floyd was murdered, there was this influx of large organizations admitting that they didn't know what what to do when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. They didn't know how to help their Black team members cope or have a safe space when they're grieving or angry or have all those emotions. So a lot of organizations started building out formal diversity, equity, inclusion teams. So around that time, I had applied for the role that I'm in now with the organization I'm with. And so my beautiful family, my son is 7, Camden, my daughter is 5, Kaya, and my wife, Jamie, and I relocated from Oklahoma to Florida. So that's where we live now. And so I've been doing this work. I actually work for a large retail organization. And so what we're going to go over today and discussing conscious language, what that looks like, is what the conversations we have in the workplace a lot. So next, this is just quick high level. By the year 2050, underrepresented or minority race and ethnicity groups will actually be the majority. And so, as you can see, in the 1970s, it was largely white, and as it increases over time, which I think is very interesting as we start to think about, where root of some of the comments and conversations that we have in words. We will discuss that too. Words and phrases that are rooted in racism that we use on a daily basis that we don't really think about. Okay, so we're going to center ourselves for this conversation what the definition of diversity, equity, inclusion is. If you Google it, it's a little bit different in your workplace, in your home, in your school, wherever that is. There may be a little bit different of a definition, but as I say it today, here is the definition that we will be centering around. So for diversity, it's the collection of identities, differences, and similarities that make us all unique. And this also includes things that are seen and unseen. So diversity is also, not all Gender identities can be visible. Not all disabilities can be visible. Even not all races can be visible. So we want to retrain our brain to stop assuming when we see someone the verbiage that we use. So the question that we ask when we're thinking about diversity is who is in the room? Looking around to make sure that there's the people that don't look, think, and talk just like us are the ones that are filling the space. And I know this is a little out of order, but for the sequence that we want to explain it, inclusion is the second one. And this is an environment where individuals feel seen, heard, valued, and a sense of belonging. Inclusion unlocks the full power of diversity, and this is a really critical piece. So diversity is easy to capture, but having individuals feel like they belong and can contribute is the harder part and the more thoughtful part that we need to complete. So the inclusion asks, has everyone's ideas been invited and heard? And if they haven't, then we have to go back and think about, are we making space for everyone's ideas to be heard? Then last, we have equity, which is all individuals are treated fairly and respectfully, have equal access to opportunities and resources, and can contribute fully. And equity asks, who is trying to get into the room but can't? And I think the best way we can, for this group of individuals, and again, I just really quickly, I'm working on my PhD in organizational psychology. Again, my bachelor and grad degrees are not in psychology. So like, I am really trying to play catch up in some of the space. So, but the best way I think I can make it relevant is when you're working on an action plan or a plan with a client or with a patient, you don't make one in the beginning of your career and you copy and paste it for all of your clients, right? You make one individual for each client that may need different resources, different times, commitments, and different longevity. And so that's the same thing. It's equity, is that you all want to get to the same play. All the clients and patients want to get to the same place, but they all need to be treated in the way, or they need to be treated in the way that gets them there successfully, which is unique, and it creates an equitable, not equal. And that's what makes it the difference between equality, is that everybody is the same and everybody gets the same. So we have marriage equality, which is kind of like that makes sense. But when it comes to providing equity in workplaces for patients, for students, it's a little bit more complex. So next, what is conscious language? So a term I'm sure all of you have heard is inclusive language. And this is very similar, but I think the main keyword that we want to call out here is that it's intentional, right? We're intentionally thinking about what we're saying, what we're going to say, the intent versus the impact. We're constantly kind of reviewing like kind of checking ourselves as we speak and interact. So conscious language is the intentional use of language that is inclusive and reflects a broad range of identities, backgrounds, and perspectives. A major thing too is that we don't continue to feed into stereotyping, or we don't create new stereotypes. It takes one person to prove a stereotype right, and it takes dozens upon dozens to prove it wrong. And so we need to kind of remove ourselves from making those assumptions again. We also don't want to demean people based on implicit bias or perceptions of personal characteristics or cultural backgrounds. So again, this is being intentional in the way that we speak and interact. So we're going to do a quick little activity. And I'm good. A question's going to pop up on the screen. And this is kind of discussing intent versus impact. And quietly to yourself, kind of think about what is the impact this question has, and what was maybe the intent that the original speaker or the questioner had. So the first one is, where are you actually from? What kind of impact would that have, especially on a person of color? You know, the intent is probably an individual is asking maybe about their ethnicity or their origin story, or their great grandparents' origin story. But I feel like the impact is different 9 times out of 10 than what the person's asking. The impact is you don't belong here, or you're othered, or you're out of place, right? The next one is, you're so articulate. I think I've heard this one quite a bit, especially again when it comes to people of color. And so what is the impact on a person of color? versus maybe the intent. And I think the intent is they're trying to give a compliment, but at the same time, the impact is you're also disregarding an entire culture because of most of the time what's being the implicitness here is you talk so white, right? You talk like me. Next is I don't see race or gender. Right. I think the intent is like, I love everybody. And I think it's well-meaning 99% of the time. However, what the impact is doing is that you're saying the thing that makes someone unique is unimportant or distracts them, right? Like we should see the whole person for every attribute that they have and appreciate and respect and celebrate all of that. And we've seen this a lot, especially, in the summer of 2020, where a lot of individuals, mostly white, were coming forward and saying, I don't see race. Everyone is the same, but we're not, right? We need to be able to identify our intersectionalities, which I'll mention a few times today. And when I say intersectionalities, it's the many identities that we have that kind of intersect, right? So my identities, I am a cisgender white woman. So that's actually 1, 2, 3. I am a lesbian. I'm a mother. I'm a spouse. I am an employee. I'm a student. I'm all these things. And so there is these microaggressions that kind of hit over several of those intersections. So I want to be seen for my full self and celebrated for all of the things that make me me. Where is your husband or wife? I think this is an interesting one too, because it's well-meaning, but we're not having that conscious piece, right? Being intentional in what we say. So the impact that we've heard is you aren't complete without a spouse. You're assuming someone's sexual orientation, that they are either say they prefer the same sex or opposite sex or non-binary, whatever. There is that this is very binary, the wife or husband. And so I think that, if there is where you're like, where's your plus one? Or did you come here with anybody? Or some other option of spouse, partner, we see that being used a lot more too. It's just, there's more inclusive ways to ask. But I don't know why this question would be a critical question that we ask in any social setting, right? Unless this person has a wife, then that's acceptable, right? Like if someone asks me, where's your wife? I'm like, oh, well, Jamie's wherever, right? But if you're meeting someone for the first time, I would steer clear, in my opinion, from this question. All right. This last one, all lives matter. And so what is the intent? I think we all know what the intent is. What's the impact? The intent is to say that it's kind of saying the same thing as I don't see race. Like I see everyone matters to me. I love everyone, all of these things. However, if we don't focus on the marginalized group that's being murdered in the streets now by police officers, how can we truly say that all lives truly matter, right? We have to put an emphasis on Black lives mattering. And I also just want to say that matter is literally the minimum, right? And so as we kind of go through today, we want to talk about what is our starting place, our starting point. What is one word or one phrase that we can focus on over the next week to retrain our brains or approaches to things, and then we can go on to the next. And I'll be sharing this deck out to whoever needs it, so you can also have this later on as well to reference. So here are some just general best practices before we dive into kind of a list of do's and don'ts of inclusive language or general conscious language. The first one is focus on the person first, not on the trait. I think this is a really good fail-safe when you're starting your journey of learning more about people who have a different lived experience than your own. And so for an example of a person, it's like person of color, right? Them being Hispanic, them being Asian American, their race or ethnicity is not the entirety of who they are. They are a person, and here is an attribute. Also, a person with a disability. versus being disabled as that is their entire existence. And we want to avoid that. So leading with person first is a great, routine or practice to start using immediately. Never assume a person's gender identity based on their name or appearance, i.e., Robin is a gender neutral name. I wear masculine presenting clothing. However, I do identify as female with she, her pronouns. So, again, we want to avoid assuming at all costs, especially now that we are creating a culture where individuals can be authentically themselves. And so if we assume, they know, what they say about assuming, right? The age old saying about making assumptions. The next says using gender neutral inclusive language when speaking with groups of people. This was a hard one for me. Saying ladies and gentlemen, guys, instead of saying guys. It took probably 6 months, honestly, to retrain my brain to say y'all or everyone, right? Is because that's just reiterates that gender is a binary where there's only male and female. And we know now that that's not true and that there is a spectrum of gender identities. And this is something that encompasses everyone. And when you say something like guys, then that's also very largely male driven. And so if you have a mixed group of individuals, that's not very inclusive. Consider historical context or cultural appropriation. Some words or phrases are rooted in negative connotations. We have a few slides at the end of this deck that will go into everyday things that I was even shocked when I started doing the research, where it's like, oh my, I probably said this last weekend. And so having to kind of start that process of the way that our generations before and then their generations before have taught us to speak and interact with one another is that we are now in a great opportunity to speak to one another in a more inclusive way and to really understand, thankfully with the internet, the origins of things that will help us to kind of understand that if we're saying what we mean. I also, kind of going back to the about me, when I got into this, the space, I was super excited to be able to show 13-year-old Robin that we made it, right? But as I did it a little bit more, it was purely selfish and continues to be purely selfish, because the fact that you all are here today and the work that you all do and the work that I do with my adult people in my office is making a safer and better place for my children, because you'll learn something, even if it's just one thing new today, and you may share that with someone else, and then they'll share that. And then the way we talk to each other, our kids overhear it, and they can feel safer and they can feel more included and seen. And so this is truly to leave the world better than we found it. And then lastly, another great piece of advice: when in doubt, ask. It's always better to ask someone what they prefer. And that also leads me into, as we kind of go into the avoids and asks, this is best practices. This does not mean that every single individual that may fit into one of these demographics agrees and wants to be addressed this way. For example, I identify as a lesbian. However, I'm also part of the queer community, but some individuals don't like the word queer. So if they say, I don't like the word queer, then you follow their lead. They know themselves best. And so some individuals will also say, I prefer to be called disabled versus a person with a disability. Then you follow that. You follow their lead at an individual basis. So this is but this is best practices, especially when you're interacting with new individuals. So first we'll start with ability and disability. I have these marked out into different sections. On the left-hand side, you can see it's a void. And on the right-hand side, here are some maybe replacements that you can use instead. So the first one is, again, we kind of mentioned this in the last slide, but describing people as disabled or handicapped, again, with that person leading, person who is blind, person who is hard of hearing. Like, let's say what we mean. Be a little bit more descriptive. It takes a half a second more of our lives. Terms that contribute to stigmas around disability or mental health. This was another one that took me some time to retrain myself. Is, if I have a work day that just is out of control, I would say, oh, today was crazy, right? But it's still kind of perpetuating this anything that's out of control, and it is crazy or insane or all of these kind of negative connotations. So saying wild instead. Today was wild, or isn't that wild? And then also say, instead of saying addicted, say I love this, or devoted to, saying what you mean versus trying to find a cute word that isn't actually cute to fill in there. Terms that contribute to stigmas around sensory disabilities like blind spot or tone deaf, saying they're unaware of this. And I think this, especially when we talk about tone deaf, this is something we use on a very, very common occurrence, especially when we talk about maybe a leader saying something that's like, well, that kind of missed the mark on what we should be saying at this time. We're saying, oh wow, he's tone deaf. And honestly, we say like maybe he's not unaware of the issues at hand, or maybe maybe she's unaware of what's really got us concerned at this time. And then lastly, instead of saying dwarf, midget, or little person, saying a person with dwarfism or shortened stature. And this is another one where these are best practices, but some individuals do prefer to be called a little person. And so again, if they correct you, if they say something, follow, do what they ask you to do. So next, we're going to talk about age and ageism. Instead of saying elderly, ancient, geezer, fossil, which these are, on paper, they're kind of funny, but also like if you're a younger person in your workplace, I mean, I have said some of these when I was younger to people that were like in their 40s, and I was like, "Ah, you're so old," and that's not the case. I learned it's funny how that comes back. So just say people over, or maybe like talking about generations like millennials or whatever group, and also like don't generalize that you're saying everyone who is a millennial doesn't want to work, right? We hear that all the time, and I don't know anybody that doesn't want to work. So like, I mean, we don't want to work, but like doesn't work for to try to own a house or try to pay for anything. Referring to aging as with a negative connotation, saying age defying or anti-aging. Getting older is a blessing, right? There's a lot of individuals who don't get that opportunity. So we need to kind of celebrate that. And I know that, I don't care about getting wrinkles, but there's a lot of people that, getting wrinkles or looking their age is scary for them. And I think that's probably mortality setting in from a mental standpoint. But, you're aging flawlessly or beautifully. And you're your best radiant self. And you can kind of tell that this was kind of created when we talk about makeup, and we talk about the way that if you look at a movie, and this is something that I've done that my wife's called me out on several occasions, like, well, she's looking her age. She's like, well, you wouldn't say that about a man. And she's right. And like we have to hold, and that's another piece, is we have to hold each other accountable too. So when you're having this conversation with your spouse on the couch and you say, well, would you say that about a man? Does it matter? I mean, she is in her 60s. She should look at her 60s, right? Only celebrating youth or being younger. And then generalizing older generations and assuming that their needs, interests might be, right? This is saying anyone over the age of 50 may need to have a walker in their house, right? Like that's a real big generalization that anybody, that a whole age group would need walkers or something, or an aid in the home. So when you're thinking about something that maybe a group of 50 to, like, you need to narrow that down a little bit, and also be realistic, because it also can make people feel very disconnected if they feel that you are already seeing them weak, and you're already kind of seeing them as needing assistance when they're not in that place. So next is race and ethnicity. Avoid saying foreigners. We'll say, people who are international. I think this is a word that's kind of going away in the US at least. Use adjectives. Example, when referring to someone's race or ethnicity, such as Mexican person or a person of Hispanic descent, not a Mexican or the blacks. We want to say, the Black community, Black people, Black team members, whatever, say what we mean again. We don't say colored people anymore. I still hear some individuals saying this. Multiracial people of color, POC, is the people or a person of color, people of color acronym, or a reference a specific ethnic group. Again, say what you mean. Not okay, here's an interesting thing that was new to me as well, is not universal. So African American is not every individual of the Black community wants to be called African American. They also don't want to be called Black, right? So again, that's where you want to follow their lead, and sometimes it's best to ask. So we say, Black team member, Black employee, whatever that is. American Indian also is not universal, because what if they're First Nations in Canada, or they're from, I think we had them in Mexico, First Nations in Mexico as well. So Native American or Indigenous is a great way to be more inclusive. And Hispanic is not all encompassing. Latinx or Latinx is really the best inclusive way to say it. And so Latinx also is Latina is female, Latino is male, and Latinx is inclusive of all of the gender identities in between. So saying both Latinx and Hispanic is really encompassing of those heritage. And then colorisms, associating dark colors or images with negative connotations. And we see this a lot, and I'm sure many who wear makeup see this, is when you see nude. It's not real. It's nude for white people. It's not nude. We're getting better, and the makeup industry has really widened to include. And Rihanna came out with her own makeup line, and so now there's more inclusion there. But before, that wasn't really true. So cover a wide range of skin tones and use descriptive words like rosy, ivory, golden, all of those things. Yeah, I'm not sure how that would fit in with a lot of the work that y'all are doing, but it's there in case you need it. So gender. Instead of using opposite sex, because that also reiterates that that gender is binary, male and female. Say different sex, because that recognizes the spectrum. Making assumptions about gender. If you don't know, it's always safer to say they, them, or ask, right? And so, but if you're talking about someone who's not in the room and you're not aware, just use they, them. And that takes some retraining of the brain. And even in the LGBTQ community, whenever the pronoun for the non-binary came out, it was difficult for us, because it was something we weren't used to, but it's something we accomplished. And so it takes a lot of thought. It takes a lot of being intentional in the moment to make sure that you're being inclusive and speaking of and to someone how they desire to be spoken to. Again, addressing a mixed gender group as guys, use everyone, friends, all, team, y'all, whatever you're comfortable with, but something that is kind of that is a gender neutral term. And then something else that we need to be more intentional about, and this is just kind of the very, very, very tippity top of the iceberg, is that the English language is rooted in male-centered wording. We're saying manpower, man the booth, mankind, man-made, manpower, fireman, policeman, when you talk about it. Or when we immediately think about leaders in an organization, or that we automatically assume they're male, because that's A, that's kind of how historically it's been, but B, that's how we were raised up talking about these things. So instead of saying manpower or manning the booth, say staff working the booth, a chairperson, humanity versus mankind, made by hand instead of man-made, excuse me, workforce, firefighter, police, all of those things. Just being more inclusive of all the identities. And then LGBTQ plus. So you may see in different settings and in different, depending on what you're working, looking at, reading, all those things. You may see LGBT, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans. But what we've done is kind of create as LGBTQ plus, which is lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, or questioning plus, which also includes intersex, asexual, allies. That's a huge thing. And so that's just kind of as these identities that aren't new, but are now getting names attached, to them, can be kind of included, and it can still fall under this umbrella. So making assumptions about marital or family relationship, use spouse or partner instead of husband or wife, use partner. These couple are also really great practices and are new, or in the places that I normally do this presentation are new. Instead of saying mother or father, saying parent or caregiver, right? Because not everyone has parents. And not everyone has a mother, not everyone has a father. In my family, we have two mothers. So if someone says, "Where's your father?" My 5-year-old's like, "Yeah, I got two moms. What you want?" Like, she doesn't care. She'll fight you over it. Um, she's scary. Just kidding. She's wonderful. She just got home. Anyways, I digress. Use sibling instead of brother or sister, because again, they may have family members who are non-binary or on the gender spectrum. So just try to say sibling. And then use children or adult children instead of daughters and sons, because they, again, that spectrum is growing. We don't say same-sex marriage anymore. We just say marriage. This is not something marriage equality is not something I thought I'd ever see in my lifetime. I actually drove 7 hours from Oklahoma to Des Moines, Iowa, because I never thought it'd be legal. And that was one of 6 states in 2011, which was 11 years ago, y'all, 11 years ago, that I thought I'd never be able to get married. And so it's still new to us. It's still fragile to the LGBTQ plus community, but it is marriage, and it's the same as marriages for everyone else.
Robin, sorry, I have one question. I was just wondering if you could see the chat. We do have a couple questions coming in. And if not, I'm happy to read them out.
Yeah, go ahead. I can't see the chat, so.
Sure. No, that's fine. I assumed not. So we just had a couple comments around Latin A instead of Latin X, because an X isn't spoken in the Spanish language, and even indigenous languages. So if you have any insight on that as to perspective or appropriate language there.
Yeah, it's a great question. And also we find this with Italy too. Everything is very male or female in the Italian language. When we're talking about someone who's not from that community, so we would say Latinx, but within that community, they know what it feels like. I don't know. They are the SME, they are the subject matter expert within those communities. We're still trying to continue how to be more broad in that term because of that, but that's kind of the best practice that's given to non-Spanish speaking individuals at this time. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, and then Dr. Lopez just noted too, these terms are very personable and dependent on the individual. First generation immigrants are not as familiar with Latinx term, but second and third generations are from his experience. So thank you for that.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that. And again, like, we need to follow the lead because it varies within even communities, right? So down here in Florida, it may be received differently than it would in Pennsylvania or Chicago or wherever you're at. Is there anything else in the chat?
No other questions, just some previous comments to your slides, some recognition and things that struck with people. So,
okay. Great. All right. So the last row in here is talking about girly girl and manly man, is really attaching gender to inanimate objects. I think we do that a lot as a society. And so also attaching like colors to things, to very gender norms. You know, we talk about like little girls should be dressed in pink and like Barbies, and little boys should like Chucks and blue, and really kind of detaching that and let the child kind of decide what they want, or let the individual decide what they want without that kind of preconceived notion or judgment. So this is a big thing, like in my own household with raising my children, is providing them with everything, more than they would ever need, and then they can choose what they like from that. Okay, so here's just some very high level framework for conscious language messaging. To drive innovation, you seek out diverse perspectives. It strengthens any organization that you're in, whether it be educational institution, whether it be in a workplace, whether it be in your community. And you achieve greater impact by having, and there's a ton of studies out there that show that efficiencies and achievement rates are much higher when you have more diverse voices and lived experiences coming together to collaborate. You create opportunity by building allyship. I think this is really important. There is also kind of a spectrum where you have allyship, which is recognizing oppression, educating yourself, continuing to you doing the own work and not kind of relying on the marginalized community to educate you every time something comes up or there's something that is being talked about in society or the media or whatever that is. But then also there comes a point where you go from allyship to advocacy, which is where you show up at the marches and the protests, or you're signing petitions, or you're voting. There's different levels of advocacy there. Um, and this is kind of like from a corporate standing, but invest in balanced teams is really being proactive and finding those diverse thoughts and lived experiences to come together and practice inclusion. And one of the things about practicing inclusion is not just making sure that every voice is heard, but also like we talk some about inclusion of introvert versus extrovert, right? So if you have a meeting of 10 individuals, there is a group that may speak at every meeting and they are louder because they feel comfortable and safe to do that because that's just in their personality to be extroverted. But it doesn't mean that the introvert or the quiet one isn't listening, isn't engaged, or doesn't have ideas. And so it's working as a leader or working in your role as a clinician or whatever that looks like, to what best fits that introvert and how do they feel safest to communicate, because they do have the ideas, they do want to have a voice, but sometimes a setting of 20 people in a room is not the best setting for them to be able to speak up. So that is part of inclusion as well. It's not just, gender, race and ethnicity, those kind of the disability, those kind of bigger things. It's really across the board that we need to be inclusive. Celebrate our many identities and our intersectionalities. Again, I had chatted about that earlier. Foster dialogue. And so if individuals, and it's not really like being a mediator, but it's also providing individuals the opportunity to talk about any situations or learnings that they want to have and encouraging education there. And then building trust. I think that's really big as you go as a white person who works with a lot of marginalized race and ethnicities and underrepresented, I have to listen before I speak, right? And that because I need to be able to provide the platform to learn before I can be an expert on anything. And then also it improves important performance and efficiencies by inspiring people. They feel like they belong, they're going to contribute more. There's a lot of science behind that. And then align any kind of core values and social norms. As you know, we talk about like being like leading with empathy is a big value that a lot of individuals have and corporations have now. And so how can you be most empathic? So it's very high level. Okay, so now we're going to shift. What is the time? Where are we at? Okay. Now we're going to shift into everyday terms that are rooted in racism. And I'm not going to hit every single one, but I did want to kind of talk about a few of them. Master bedroom. This is one that we have in homes. Even realtor.com and the Realtors Association has shifted from saying master bedroom to primary bedroom. And so because it was a term, the master was from slavery era connotations. Cakewalk's another one. So the cakewalk originated as a dance performed by enslaved Black people on plantations before the Civil War. It was intended to be a mockery of the way white people danced, though plantation owners often interpreted slaves' movements as unskillful attempts to be like them. And I think that was interesting because, I mean, elementary schools still do this all the time, the cakewalks. Peanut gallery is another one that I think we use a lot in today's language. Names a section in theaters, usually the cheapest and worst, where many Black people sat during the era of vaudeville. And then gypsy. This is one this is a new one for me, but it's become synonymous with cheating or someone who doesn't want to work and kind of travels from town to town and steals and does these things, especially in the Romani group culture. But over here in the States, when we talk about gypsy, it's someone who's just free spirited. And, like we have this thing is they just don't really care what anyone thinks. And they're, they may be into certain things or whatever, but still like it's kind of rooted in a mockery. And so we need to kind of untrain our brains in saying that. White lie is another one. And this one we actually stumbled upon. We were watching a movie called White Lie a couple weeks ago. I was like, this sounds like this is going to be rooted in racism. So you look it up. And so again, this is attributing cleanliness to the color white and like white people are pure and Black people, anything that has to do with like a negative like the dark colors or shades is negative, not everything, but and we talk about this language. And a white lie is a harmless or trivial lie, especially one told to avoid hurting someone's feelings. During the 14th century, white was linked to morally or spiritually pure, using versus using the color black to demonstrate immoral or evil. That was an interesting one. Grandfather clause. I think this is another interesting. We say we grandfathered into some sale price or whatever that is a statutory or constitutional device enacted by 7 southern states between 1895 and 1910. It provided that those who had enjoyed the right to vote prior to 1866 or 1867 or their lineal descendants would be exempt from educational, property, or tax requirements for voting. Because the former slaves had not been granted the franchise until the adoption of the 15th Amendment in 1870, those clauses work effectively to exclude Black people from voting. Shuck and jive. This is a modern usage of this phrase, refers to pandering, selling out, or instances in which Black people go along with racist white people wishes. Exotic, this is also something else. The best way to say this is exotic should be used when you're talking about a plant or something. What we don't talk about people being exotic. So what it means very different, strange, or unusual, or not living or growing naturally in a particular area for another part of the world, from another part of the world. So this shouldn't be described to use humans. It may be described to say it's very exotic that there's a palm tree in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Like that is out of place. That is something that doesn't grow there. But a human existing somewhere that you wouldn't assume they existed is could be very racist and is also exclusionary. Spirit animal is another one. This is the ancient concept of animal guides, particularly prominent in some indigenous, especially Native American religions and cultures. This was also adopted by pagan and Wiccan spirituality in the 1990s. So you hear people say like, oh, that person or that thing is, or that action is my spirit animal. It's actually very close to the Native American indigenous people. And if you don't know the full meaning, you shouldn't be saying it, especially if it's about a TikTok video where there's a little girl doing something funny or something like that. All right. So I'm rounding out here, but I've also included links here for resources for further education and more details of the topics that I've discussed today. And I've tried to kind of fit them into things that make sense for you all in your fields and your space. So Anxiety and Depression Association of America, Psychology Today, and American Psychological Association. So here's just some very starter points. Internet is your friend. It is not your underrepresented friends, classmates, educators, community members' responsibility to keep you educated on their demographic or their communities. So we need to be making sure that we're taking a proactive approach to learning and keeping ourselves up to date. And once you know better, you can do better. And I also, before I kind of open it up to questions, want to just say, this is a process. Retraining your brain and rethinking the way that you've always talked for however many years is going to take time. So I'm just going to tell you, please have grace with yourself. Don't beat yourself up. If you misspeak, recognize it. You don't have to say it out loud. Restart, and then continue and remember for next time. We don't need to make a big deal about it every single time that you may say something. It's just you recognizing the problem is the first step. And so if you can say, oh man, I just said you guys. Okay, track that. You're recognizing it. Next time, let's try to use y'all. If you say it again, track that. I still mess up, especially if someone else in the conversation says guys. I start thinking about that so much, and then I start down this rabbit hole. So, but with that, so have grace with yourself. It takes time. I'm so excited you all came today. I hope you all take one thing from today and can implement it. 1 month at a time, you work on something. But with that, my portion is done. I don't, where are we at a time? There is a few minutes for questions if anyone has any questions, and I'll try to answer those.
Yeah, I was going to say questions and comments. We had some comments come in via the chat throughout your presentation. So if you can come off mute, come on camera, we would love to have you. But otherwise, Robin, great presentation. Thank you.
Absolutely. I'm trying to figure out how I can.
Joey, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering, Robin, if you have advice for speaking to a family member who is definitely not likely to access the resources that you have given us today. When they complain about, for instance, I was trying to explain to a family member a while back why using the word "jip" is not appropriate, and they just threw up their hands in frustration, said, all this PC, it's a million more syllables, it's stressful, I have to think about it all the time, these pronouns, and I just give up.
Yeah.
What would you say to some, and I have to admit myself, sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, it's going to take me 5 paragraphs to explain what I could in 3 words. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
how do you start talking about that, or wrapping your head around that, or trying to guide someone who has good intentions, but the impact of what they're saying is harmful?
A great question. I think the easiest step, there's two things that there is an easy introduction that feels non-threatening to them, right? Is first try to explain it in a way that they can comprehend, right? So, for example, when we talk about poverty and socioeconomic differences, my in-laws don't, or actually, even to narrow it down even more, white privilege. They don't understand. They're like, I worked for everything I have and all of these things. And so then the way that I was able to get through to them, to even start be able to have a conversation where it's not defense mode for them, is saying, okay, well, let's talk about education. Let's talk about elementary schools. How are elementary schools funded? And taking it down to the tax dollar, the neighborhoods, all of those things, and taking it to something that's a very simple introduction for them. And then when they were able to absorb that, we can expand the conversation a little bit more. But we couldn't do it until they could comprehend where the root of it is. Secondly, kind of the same advice that I've given you today is start with one thing. You can't change an entire person's viewpoint. You can't change the entire way that they interact with the world. So if saying "jip" is maybe too broad for them, maybe it's like bringing it down. Again, without having all the context or reading it, I don't know fully, but it's like bringing it down to be very narrow. And so then it's a conversation versus so much an attack. And that when people start shutting down is when we know no impact or change can be made. So I hope that's helpful, Joey.
Yes, thank you.
Anybody else?
This is Felice Mays, and I just wanted to say this is such a good presentation. It would be great for my undergraduate students to see it, but it's really good for anyone. I mean, it was even eye-opening, just some of the phrases that, I mean, I'm always trying to push myself and learn, and like you said, lead with empathy and be sensitive. But when you said like the grandfathering in, I was like, oh my gosh, I've said that before, and just some things like you don't know until you know. And so I really
Absolutely.
appreciate you just highlighting some of those that I had just never even thought of before.
Well, thank you so much for that feedback. And absolutely. And I think it's, you don't know what you don't know until you know, right?
Hmm.
And so having these conversations and this opportunity to come share with you all, to at least, I mean, again, this is the tip of the iceberg, but if you can take one or two things away and share them, and again, you'll have this deck, and if you have any questions, I'm available to help in any way that I can too, because this is important work, and these are important topics. And especially with your students, having them in the classroom, especially, being down here in Florida with the Don't Say Gay bill, you're seeing students at every level, and that's also creating that sense of belonging in the classroom. All right. Anybody else?
I think we're good.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Robin. We greatly appreciate it. I did put it in the chat, but this session and all the other sessions from the virtual conference this week will be posted on our YouTube channel, and I will follow the conference with emails and links and references and all those things. So stay tuned. But again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.